Greetings, Culture Warriors. It is I, Jeff Vieira, author of Culture is Everything, and your host for this latest dispatch from the front. Today, I want to talk to you about a topic that underlies many of the stories that we cover here. We talk generally about stories affecting the business world, the economy. Also, we've talked about the wider culture of America and Western civilization from time to time. But one of the things that I think this pandemic has really exposed is kind of a hidden factor, a hidden value, if you will, that is now being exposed as somewhat less than useful to society and to the world. And that value is something that, for lack of a better term, for the moment, we'll just call expertise. You know, you see it all the time in online discussions about the pandemic and our response to it, where one of the common refrains is, hey, what do you know? You don't have X degree. The assumption there is that the degree heralds some sort of relevant expertise to whatever topic is being discussed. Now, this is a little bit fallacious just right on the face of it, because we all know that truth is truth regardless of who says it. So if I say the sky is blue and a meteorologist says no, the sky is yellow, and someone independently looks up, they can see for themselves who is right. Is it the meteorologist or is it me? And I think you'll find that these days there are many an expert who is not really channeling their expertise, but rather hewing to a particular ideology or political bent when they make their pronouncements. In fact, this has led me to offer the definition of an expert is someone whose predictions in a given field come true. I think that's the only measure of expertise when you get down to it. I am a Six Sigma Master Black Belt. I've been in quality about 25 years. And one of the things that I'm able to do, based simply on some objective data, is to predict what the actual failure rate is in manufacturing something. So I used to do this all the time when I was a supplier quality manager back in the day. And we had Asian suppliers who would sometimes submit data where they had cherry-picked their test results. We had a qualification process for a new supplier. We're moving a lot of work to Asia. They had a vested interest in that work going there. So sometimes they would send in their data and they would sort out the defects thinking that they would get a better grade. What they didn't realize was that because of my expertise in the application of statistical analysis to quality, we were able to actually calculate what the true defect rate was based on the inherent variation in what we saw. So if a part required, for example, that a diameter be, say, a 1/4 inch plus or minus 1/1000th of an inch, they would send in those parts. We would measure the diameters on them, compare them to what they got. And when we looked at the entire population of what they sent in, which is usually about 30 parts, we would find and be able to map a curve regarding that diameter. And on the basis of that curve, we knew, okay, well, they produced this many that were too large and this many that were too small. And the specific approach that was used is something that's called process capability analysis. Very common tool in quality in Six Sigma. It's nothing special. I'm not claiming any particular genius in the application of it. Merely that one of the useful things you can do with it is to say, all right, out of this entire population, based on the inherent variation we see part to part, you've got a 10% defect rate. And this rarely failed to shock the suppliers when I was able to quote them something they thought they were hiding by simply sorting out all the defects. They would pre-sort them, they would measure them themselves. Any defects they found, they would throw away, and they would just replace with a good part. That is a measure of expertise. I knew how to find out what the real rate was based on the parts I had and the inherent variation between them. Okay, that in that particular application, that was what established me as an expert, if you will. So when you come to the current pandemic and you see things like people predicting 2.2 million deaths from COVID-19, the Wuhan virus, in the United States of America, and those deaths don't manifest themselves even at the peak of the epidemic, what can we say about that particular expert? Even if we didn't know that this particular expert, Niall Ferguson, who developed the Imperial model over in the UK, if we didn't know that he was going off during the height of the epidemic and having sex with his mistress, which you would think, if you believe that you're in the middle of a deadly pandemic, would be a no-no. So let's put that aside and let's just look at the prediction. The prediction was laughably off. Moreover, as we went through the epidemic and got more and more data, the predictions didn't get any better. So what does that tell you? You know, in my world, in my profession, we refer to modeling and we rate models based on their skill. What does skill mean? It means that their predictions come true. That's a model that has no skill. And I would argue that the person who developed the model, there's not much skill and evidence there either. So would you continue to quote that expert as we go through the pandemic? The answer is no. I wouldn't believe a word they said. The same thing's true of Fauci. The same thing's true of Blix. The same thing's true of all of these clowns who have been on the news making these dire warnings, these fearful portents of doom that never materialize. Now, there's only one benefit to those dire predictions, and that's that it keeps people like Fauci and Blix and the rest in power and in front of the cameras. The news that the pandemic is gone, that it's waned, that it's no longer a threat, or that it was never that significant of a threat to the population as a whole, is good news. Will be good news to just about everybody in the world. But bad news to those people. And so you don't get it. Instead, they just double down on dumber predictions. And you can see, if you look around on the internet or whatever, you can get lists of these people's poor predictions and when they made them. This is how you get situations where, at the outset of this pandemic, we were assured that the virus was no big deal at all. At the height of it, we were warned that this was a plague, and that there would be no antibodies to it, and that we would never be rid of it, and that it would tear through the population and kill everybody. All this nonsense and fear-mongering that we saw at the height of this thing when it was useful to do so. There was the masks are useless phase, which happened early on in this. And then there was the masks are essential phase, which we're in right now. They have made completely contradictory suggestions as to how to deal with this one day to the next. And then you get the situations where there are politically protected activities that make no sense if the pandemic was the way they would said it were. For example, Fauci actually came out and said that if you wanted to have your gay hookup during the pandemic, that would be just fine. Claim that the virus wasn't transmitted during sex. What an odd virus that it can be transmitted simply by walking past one another in a grocery store, but cannot be transmitted with much more intimate contact than that. It's ludicrous. Now, this week, they're coming out and saying, well, you should wear your mask during sex. Unbelievable. It's a virus that is extremely contagious if you're in church praying, especially if you're singing, but not contagious at all if you're in a cramped liquor store drinking. Again, you've heard many examples, so I'm not going to bore you with that. They're all out there. But the net of it is that the so-called experts have discredited themselves utterly. And yet we so value the notion of expertise that the reflexive defense of anyone when you question this stuff is, well, who are you? It should be sufficient to say, well, I'm not them, given that those experts have been discredited. Richard Feynman, who I greatly admire, was a physicist who worked on the Manhattan Project, and he was very much a character. Taught at Stanford for a number of years. His books are absolutely riveting if you get a chance to read them. You do not have to be a science geek, a math geek, or any other kind of geek to enjoy them because of the way that he tells his story. You know, a particularly good one to get if you're of a mind is, surely you're joking, Mr. Feynman. Absolutely wonderful. But Feynman was skeptical of authority. The whole point of science, to Feynman's mind, was to eliminate the need for authority. Because the results are the results. If you're an authority and your test results cannot be replicated, guess what? It doesn't matter what your authority is. Facts are facts. The real world is the real world, and that's it. Feynman was not one for this my truth nonsense. There's no my truth. There is the truth and everything else. And so Feynman was fond of saying the people ought to think for themselves. And one of the ways he got that point across, and he showed it in his own work when he developed the Feynman diagrams, which were a vast improvement over the way electromagnetism used to be explained. And what Feynman used to say was, look, if you cannot explain something to a first-year physics student, say, you simply don't understand it well enough. You have to be able to explain it simply. The whole point is so that they understand it, and if it's reality, they should be able to understand it. There was, back in the 18th century, a famous dictionary writer. They had such things back then. It was relatively new. You've heard of Webster, of course, but the man who kind of first put the English language between two covers was Samuel Johnson. And his biographer, the biography he wrote of Johnson is said to be the best biography ever written, was a man named Boswell. And he recounted an argument where he got a little bit too cute with Johnson and tried to kind of twist him in knots over the nature of reality and said, yeah, but how do you prove reality? It's a variation of the same argument that some people are having today, claiming that we are living in a virtual reality simulation like the Matrix because they can't explain things. And so Boswell basically asked him, well, how do you refute the notion that this may all be an illusion? To which Johnson's answer was to kick a large rock and say, I refute it thus. A pretty simple, elegant way to refute it. The way I tend to put it is that reality is that which doesn't care about your feelings. Doesn't matter how you feel about it. It is what it is. And so with regard to expertise, You are an expert if you can predict and forecast reality. And you are not an expert if you cannot. So if we're going to invoke the experts, as Feynman notes with regard to the scientific method, well, fine. Then we should be able to reproduce your results, your analysis. And that's where the non-experts get really wiggy. One of the controversies early on in the climate change debate was when Michael Mann played some games with his data. He did some transforms on the data, which produced his infamous hockey stick, showing that this unprecedented rise in average temperatures. And they were asked, as is common in such situations, to produce their data so that other people could analyze the raw data and see if they came to the same conclusion. This is the normal way of doing things in science, and they refused. They refused to provide that data. And then wiggy things started happening, and it started disappearing, and all the stuff you would suspect if someone was caught with their hand in the scientific cookie jar. So that really should have been the end of Michael Mann's, quote, expertise in the field of climatology. Once you start doing dodgy stuff like that, you've got no expertise. It was really cemented when you heard a number of those predictions. By the end of this century, we will be, this city will be underwater and yada, yada. All the stuff that Al Gore spat out in his nonsense book, Earth in the Balance. And none of those predictions came true. At least not the ones that got all the press coverage. And so then we wound up with the rolling apocalypse, which is very similar to what some fundamentalist Christian sects do with regard to when the end of the world is coming. They tell you we've gone back through the Bible and determined with great certainty that the end of the world is going to be December 22nd, 2024. And they ride that for a while. And then guess what happens? December 22nd, 2024 comes and goes, and we are all still here. You don't hear trumpets. You don't see archangels. Day of Judgment, not here. And so what do they invariably do when that happens? Aha, we have recalculated it, and now we've discovered our error. It turns out that the end of the world will be on July 7th, 2031. And a few people fall away realizing what a scam it was, but a surprising number stick with it and keep buying the nonsense. Keep buying into the, quote, expertise of the biblical scholar that produced those dates, the numerologist. It's the same. It's been the same thing with climate change. No matter how many times they've been proved wrong in terms of their predictions that they've made, the lack of skill in their models, etc., people keep buying into it. And what makes it even funnier is that they do so in the context of a warming climate, whereas for the 30 or 40 years before it, they did so in regard to a cooling climate. You'll find, you go back to the 70s and 60s and everything, you'll find a bunch of books on the coming ice age. Can't both be right, right? But the whole point, I think, of those scares and now the pandemic scare is to keep you scared and to keep you listening to whatever nonsense they propose. I'll never forget when I was a freshman at the Air Force Academy, they put us in, right on the tail end of basic cadet training or early in the fourth class year. They pulled us all into this big auditorium and they gave us the annual spiel from the local college professor talking about how we were heading towards peak oil and how our inability to understand logarithmic progression led us to not understand that our lives and our children's lives were going to be irreparably harmed by the fact that we were going to be out of fossil fuels. He did this every year. And every year he'd say, by X year, we'll be completely out of fossil fuels. And of course, when that year came and went, he would just update his number. By this year, we'll be out of fossil fuels. It was a joke. It was a joke. But he scared a number of people, and people walked out of that particular lecture convinced that we were all doomed. It was utter and complete nonsense, and is especially funny given what fracking did for American oil reserves and access to them. Net of it is peak oil is as bogus a concept as the others. But the point was to scare people. And so they would order us in to be scared. Because you see, when people are frightened, they tend not to question authority. They defer to expertise for as long as they're frightened. Once they realize that there's nothing to be afraid of, well, the expertise tends to fall into discredit, and the expert tends to be shown the door. You see this all the time, right? Where dictators fall, it is because people no longer fear them. Whether that's Mussolini or Ceausescu, people no longer fear you. You tend to wind up strung up from a lamppost somewhere. And that's the end of your reign. So why don't we value then experts whose predictions are actually borne out? You would think it would be a logical thing to do, but why aren't we doing it? It's funny because you see this in a lot of different contexts, right? If you follow things like the NFL draft, for example, every year, professional football teams get together to decide which college prospects are going to which team. And they do this in the form of a draft based on how the team did the prior year, basically. And so there's all this coverage in the run-up to the draft. All this scouting report stuff, NFL Combine, where they do exercises and show off their physical abilities, etc. And everyone pretends to be an expert. And then you get to draft night, and you get the so-called experts gathered around, and no matter who is picked, especially early on, you watch the first round, this is always the case, they all sit there and say, oh, that was a great pick. Oh, that was a great pick. That was a wonderful pick. If you remember, one of the biggest draft busts ever, if not the biggest, was when the Raiders took Jamarcus Russell out of LSU. Jamarcus Russell had a huge arm, pretty dominant player in college, and so everyone was on about what a great pick Jamarcus Russell was. The only thing they didn't count on was Jamarcus Russell was lazy and didn't seem to have the aptitude to study film, which is something that every professional quarterback had better be doing a lot of. And so Jamarcus Russell took his $70 million signing bonus and made it rain in strip clubs and in the coaches' meetings. But what Jamarcus Russell didn't do was study his playbook and look at any film. And so predictably, Jamarcus Russell stunk the joint out on the field. And they made excuses for him initially because he was the top pick in the draft. And then eventually they realized that he was an absolute bust. But what's funny is going back to draft night and seeing all these clowns swear what a great player Russell was, what a great pick he was, and how he was going to change the game, simply on the basis of the fact that other people said the same crap. And so I've kept an eye on every draft since and seen the exact same pattern. And yet these guys who make these predictions and do their mock drafts and all these bogus predictions they make, and yet they're back again every year. The same friggin' guys. I would much rather see the guy up there who actually killed with his fantasy football league because maybe he knows something they don't. But they don't, because these guys, are assumed to have this encyclopedic knowledge of football, even where it's not in evidence. Even where it's not in evidence, where it's been refuted. It's the same thing in politics. All these posters, it's fascinating. When you look in the middle of a campaign, say, for president, all these pollsters start showing blowout wins for the Democratic candidate. It's like clockwork. Doesn't matter what the election is. They all show it about the middle of the election. Then, right before the election, it's always neck and neck. Always. What's the difference? Well, when you're raising money for a campaign, you got to excite people with the thought that their candidate's going to win. So that's what they do. So they want to see the Democrat presidential candidate win every time, always. And so they push it. And you can see this in the composition of the poll when you look into the target audience. Now, the only thing that matters is how are people who are going to vote. That's the only thing that matters. Instead, what they'll do in the middle of the campaign season is they'll look at registered voters. Registered voters tend strongly Democratic. They also won't adjust for party affiliation. So you'll have an overrepresentation of Democrats in those polls. So in other words, you want to know how they're going to poll? Well, I'll tell you how they're going to poll. They determine the outcome of the poll by picking the sample they did. It's a push poll. It's not a legit measure where the American electorate is, where the voting public is at. That takes more effort. That takes more money. They're not interested in doing that. Their outcome is we want to discourage people voting for the non-Democrat candidates, and we want to encourage people to open up their checkbooks for the Democrat candidates. So this is what they do. They try to create a narrative of inevitability. Okay? In our American system, you can't just win the total popular vote. You have to win each state. And so you can really screw someone up if your polls show them badly performing in battleground states that they need to win. That's why non-Democrat candidates in particular have taken to having their own polling operations completely independent of the media polls. It costs them money, but it gives them much more accurate information. They got suckered one too many times by the big three network polls lying. But it leads to issues during the campaign because you'll invariably see the non-Democrat candidates saying, hey, we're doing a lot better than they're saying we're doing. We hear and they show people their internal polls. Hey, here's how we're doing. Which is something that obviously the Democrat candidate doesn't have to do. But the Democrat candidate has a problem on election night. And that problem is they have to explain why in the last days before the election, the race tightened up. It didn't really tighten up. It stopped being misreported. Because you see, those pollsters know that at the end of the day, they're going to be perceived based on how accurate the polls are. Their next polling gig is going to be with somebody who will remember how well they predicted the biggest poll in recent memory, the presidential election. And so in the end, they have to get close to the mark. In the run-up to it, they can be as far off and nobody cares. But people will remember, and in the next election, they'll say, In the election, whatever, this was the most trusted pollster. Right? But think about it. That's their only job. It's their only job. So you would think they would be a little bit better at it if they were truly expert. Because all they're doing, when you get right down to it, is relaying what people are telling them. Now that means you have to be perceived as being honest. You have to ask objective questions and refrain from your tendency to place a hand on the scale, which voters can detect. You have to make a concerted effort to reach out to a voting bloc that is representative of the likely voters on election day. That means you can't just sample your Democrat pals. You have to find ways to reach Republican voters who are highly skeptical based on your past polls. And you can't ladder them up with questions like, the Democrat candidate believes in puppies and kittens. The Republican candidate wants to kill puppies and kittens. Which do you support and why? You have to ask objective, neutral questions, and you have to choose a medium which is going to represent that audience. So, for example, if one political party's followers, guess whose, work overwhelmingly and are not present during the day to take phone calls because they're at work, and you decide to conduct your poll between the hours of 10 a.m. and 12 p.m., you're going to oversample the other party. It's just the way it is. If one party is on the internet more than the other, and you're using landline calls to get your samples, well, they may not have landlines. I know I don't. You're going to find it difficult to get a representative sample. You have to be interested in the truth. Reality as it is, not reality as you wish it were, in order to provide an effective gauge of this. And pollsters get paid a lot of money, and they still try to put that finger on the scale. There was one famous pollster who only shows the ability to predict when it's a Democrat victory. But it's funny, when you dig into their methodology, and he's supposed to be a great statistical geek, etc., when you dig into his methodology, you find that there's a large portion of it that is his gut call. It's got nothing to do with data. It's just he feels this, and he makes an arbitrary adjustment to the data. Well, guess what? His arbitrary adjustments invariably favor his favorite party, and that throws off the accuracy of his polling. And yet he is viewed as an expert. Why? Because he can talk in numbers, and people don't understand numbers as a general rule. But even though he's missed the mark many a time, in fact, in the 2016 election, he predicted that Hillary Clinton had a 95% chance of winning right before she lost the key battleground states that threw the Electoral College to Donald Trump. So many people went to sleep thinking that there would be President Hillary Clinton and woke up to discover President Donald Trump. They still haven't gotten over that shock. So, my friends, where I want to leave it with you is respect the wisdom of a man like Richard Feynman, an actual certified genius who's accomplished real things in life and who gives us wisdom that's applicable and you can test with your own eyes. Don't trust someone's alleged expertise. Make them demonstrate it to you. They should be able to explain reality in a simple manner that you can understand, even if you're not an expert in that field. So if they're going to talk to you, for example, about the need to wear a mask to prevent the transmission of coronavirus, They should be able to explain to you exactly how cloth fibers with gaps in them that are 6 times greater than the size of the largest virus particle traps the virus reliably. Explain that to me. If I cough and sneeze, show me why it is that my boxers wrapped around my head are keeping those virus particles from getting out into the atmosphere where another poor soul can breathe them in. It's really, really simple when you think about it, right? A meme to the contrary showed somebody erecting a chain link fence saying that they were going to keep out mosquitoes. And that's about right. So you have to explain how that chain link fence can keep out mosquitoes if you really want to explain how a cloth mask works. Simple. And if you can explain it, then guess what? You ain't no expert. Because at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, anyone can claim to be an expert in anything, but culture is everything.